At this point, I don't even know how many times I have stood in front of this car and recorded something along the lines of, I know it's been forever since I touched this car, but today we're finally gonna get it done. But this time, I mean it for real. This is my 2011 Jaguar XFR, and it has been sitting here in the background of videos and as a pain in my butt and a constant reminder that it is not yet done for months upon months upon months. Over the last few months, I have slowly recorded a few different clips and a few different things and slowly chipped away at some of the work. And what that means is, thankfully, this is almost ready to go back in. In the last video with this car, I explained that I got a ported supercharger casing, which I have since installed on the supercharger components. We got a whole bunch of XFRS goodies that will also be installed through this process, and I've slowly chipped away at a few things. Like, I've replaced the engine mounts on the engine because those were done. I've done almost all of the intake valve cleaning. I left some of it to do on camera here as we're going along so I can show a little bit what that looks like. And I've chipped away at a bunch of these small around the edges things so that hopefully now we are pretty damn close to just getting this thing all buttoned up and put back in the car. So that being said, it is time, far and above it is time. This engine needs to get back in that car and we need to get it back on the road ASAP. Let's do it. As we had left off, we can see the blower has just been sitting here hanging from my engine crane for the last couple weeks, and it is definitely time that we get back going on this so we can get this back in there, we can get this outside and out of the way so we've got space freed up in the shop, and we can get this back on the road. I'm not sure which blower parts we're actually going to be using. As we can see here as I spin it, these superchargers come with a Teflon coating on the rotors, and the idea is that's supposed to help dissipate heat and help things move through better, because basically it makes the rotors slippery, if that makes sense. So there's less resistance for the air as it gets squeezed and pushed through and into the engine. And unfortunately, as we can see, there is definitely wear on that coating slash on the rotors in both engines. And both of them feel quite nice for sure. Neither one of them seems to be binding or anything like that. But it turns out rebuilding these rotor packs is actually kind of a pain. The rest of this supercharger assembles and disassembles quite easily, but as we're putting it together with our new ported parts, there's going to be a bit of a challenge in what rotor pack slash innards we use. I don't know if we should use the ones from this blower, the ones from this blower, or if we should try and get a complete new rotor pack altogether. I made some calls and it's not super easy, but there is a couple places down south in the States that rebuild these blowers, and I think we'd be able to either just buy a fresh rebuilt rotor pack that is brand new with new Teflon coating and whatever else, which should be even a bit of a performance gain, but it's going to be very expensive. So what I'm thinking at the moment is we will probably try and sell one blower. I haven't decided which one we will sell and which one we will use, because at the moment they're both in very similar condition. Both of these blowers have been recently serviced. Both of them feel very smooth. Neither one of them was rattling that loud or anything like that. So we'll probably just take one of the two blowers for now and put the innards in the ported casing. And I mean, at some point in the future, we could decide to send it and get it rebuilt. But at that point, it shouldn't really change much other than we'd have to pull it back off of the engine, which is annoying, but is supposed to be doable with it in the car. Plenty of people do it. And so long as we get these dowels all cleaned up and greased much better, removing it with it in the car should be so much easier. And I mean, at that point, if those are greased up and it's not too bad, all we'll really have to do is disconnect 1, 2, 3 bolts and 2 more over here, and then we will be able to just lift it out. The bolts itself are really easy to get to. The lid is pretty easy to remove with the supercharger still in the car. So we could decide, and will likely decide, to just put the ported blower together with innards we already have, slash a couple new bearings and whatever else. And then at some point down the line, if we'd really like to, we can decide to get the blower rebuilt and forget about it. But for now, it would be nice to have the car just back together and on the road. Okay, so we're making progress. It's very slow and it has been so long since I've been in here, but we've got the other car pulled out. I just bolted the subframe back to the front of the high mileage car, made sure everything was all sealed up, and we pulled it outside where it is currently sitting out of the way so we have access to another bay. We've got some parts on the way to get this ready to go back into its original chassis. Shouldn't be anything too crazy, but engine and transmission mounts, a couple of gaskets and things like that. And the next step in the process for us, we got to get this blower pulled apart to see. I'm really hoping that we will be able to take the innards from this blower and put them in the ported casing. We've got the blower from the original 140,000 kilometer car sitting on the bench here. You can see that by our grip tech pulley that we put on before. Hopefully pulling this apart should give us some better answers on what we need to do / what we need yet to get the ported blower installed in this engine, because I'd really like to do that before we put this back in the car, because it is going to be a hindrance anyways, and it really wasn't too bad to pull this blower off with the engine out. I don't really feel like playing around with it too much with it reinstalled in the chassis, and we can't drive it anyways until we have the blower situation sorted. So let's get you guys set up and get tearing this thing apart. Slowly making our way. We've got the two inlet manifold wings, I guess you could say, the two pieces that go on the sides of the actual blower itself, because how the air works on this guy is it goes in here, out here, over through the charge coolers and down into our intake valves. I've got those couple pieces pulled off. I'm just in the middle of getting all the accessory portion off of here. I used my Sharpie to mark where the bolt was / where this was mounted, just so we have that on record. I don't think it's going to be too big of a deal because we'll be able to set it up where it needs to be static and closed versus open, which isn't too bad. But as you can see here, we definitely need to replace these vacuum lines, as this thing is literally degrading in front of our eyes. You can quite literally watch all the dust of this hose falling apart. Small win, but a win nonetheless. It turns out it indeed did have a solid coupler, just like the coupler we have sitting on the side, except I think this one is a little lower quality. It's probably really hard to tell on camera because it looks identical, but when I compare it to this one, I had just put it on this shaft to see if it would fit. This is the shaft that came with our ported blower in our box of ported blower parts. You can feel, this one does feel a little more solid and a little bit better quality. This one comes from ZZP, and I'd have to go and reference their website. They talk about the specific blend of plastic that this one is, and it does feel like it's a little different material than this, and of course we can see that in the difference in color. I think either or is just fine. We'll probably use the ZZP one as we put it back together, and I mean, we could definitely use this at another point as well. This thing looks brand new. Like I say, right before I had bought the car, the supercharger had been serviced, and this is a great exemplification of that. But yeah, it's great because we still have this one here. I think we will still use the ZZP one anyways. And also, it is hard to tell just yet, but we shall see. Hopefully there's a bearing we can replace here, because it's not much. It's not much, but I'm sure you can definitely hear a little bit of play as I move this shaft around. We'll see what happens as we go into it deeper. That's not exactly a great start to moving the back part of this. I know this can't be shown through camera. This is the worst smelling fluid I think I've ever smelled in my life. I popped off the cap because the fluid for the supercharger lives in the back housing here. You know how when you open a carbonated drink, you kind of get that of the carbonation? This just made a very similar sound, and it smells so terrible. I'm not stoked to see what's inside. Once again, these seem to be really difficult for whatever reason to pull apart. This one was kind of difficult, so was the snout. Neither one of them really wanted to come off, but both of them are off now. And now, as we can see here, I think we've got some fun ahead of us, because there's actually another plate here, and I'm going to assume, I could be wrong on this, but I'm going to assume this plate completely houses the rotor pack assembly, and it is sandwiched by the end plate here. We're just about to drain the fluid out and into my bucket here just to kind of get it out of the way. And then after that, we're gonna have some fun figuring out how to get this separated from the rest of the casing assembly itself, because I believe after that there will be needle bearings on the other end, and we're just gonna have to kind of do some figuring on how exactly this rotor pack gets separated from the main body of the supercharger. We're slowly making progress. We're going to sidebar on the supercharger for the time being. The problem we are up against is we need to remove this outer piece from the inner piece right here, because this on the inside is the shaft that goes direct to the rotor pack, and this is what's stopping it from going out through the bearing, so the bottom part of the rotor pack can come out of the body and go into the new body of the ported blower. I tried a couple things to get the rotor pack removed. It didn't really work, but that's okay because I found a tool pack online for a few $100s that should have everything I need in it to get the old bearings out, the new bearings in it to the supercharger casing, get that rotor hub off of the shaft, and be able to swap the rotor pack from that casing into our ported casing with way more ease. Our new engine mounts and our new transmission mount have all showed up, which is freaking awesome because we can get the engine mounts back on while this is all out of the car. I don't know how a guy would do it with it in the car, but I'm sure it would not be easy whatsoever. Our new gaskets are in for these guys right here on the heads, which will make getting the supercharger back on once it's rebuilt possible and much safer, so we're not worried about leaks. We'd have to pull everything right back apart. I'm gonna get going on removing the fluid from the gearbox and the gearbox from the engine. This thing literally could not be more apart as it sits. We've got a chassis of a car there, a gearbox here, a subframe there, an engine there, supercharger parts, not even a complete blower over there, and a whole bunch of stuff to reassemble the car sitting right there. We've got our trunk lid, we've got our new XFRS wing, our wheels, our brakes, and a whole bunch of other good stuff over there, along with a third black XFR that is here via work. That's just kind of chilling in the middle. Ignore this. This thing is beautiful, but it is not one of mine. Fortunately and unfortunately, because I do not need any more cars at the moment, but this thing is in really good shape, and it's kind of cool to see. Well, we've created a nice little puddle underneath of the engine here. I've just been giving it a good degrease with some spray nine, and that's pretty clean. I got a little bit more cleaning to do, but overall, it's looking pretty good. We're going to switch gears here, and I'm going to take all of this and turn it into one functional ported blower. We ended up ordering in new bearings. There is an awesome place on eBay that you can source these bearings from. So we got our two ones for the snout right here, and then we've got our ones that go inside the blower housing right here. It turns out these are a royal pain in the rear end to get. The only place I found them to get was all on eBay. And now we've got our ported blower housing right here. Got our ported snout right here, the old snout right here, and our old rotor pack right here. So we need to clean this up, install the new bearings in, install the rotor pack back in the housing, install the new bearings in the snout, install the shaft and the pulley on the new snout right here, put it all back together so it can go back on there. I'm gonna set you guys up. Let's get her done. Well, as you guys can see, we are making along fantastic. We still have to finish cleaning up the inlet manifolds for the sides of the blower, But aside from that, the blower is pretty much all built. We've got our rotor pack installed in the ported housing. We've got new fluid in the back for the gear portion of the rotor pack because we've got our input for the drive here, which spins this rotor. There's gears in the back that spin this rotor. And everything works in conjunction. We've got a new bearing here, and then new bearings inside the case. We weren't able to rebuild the rotor pack itself, but that is very expensive and hard to do. And I mean, everything is super smooth, happy, and healthy. I'm pretty stoked about that. We've got our throttle body on, which I had a good buddy of mine port. I'll show you guys right here. We take a look inside. Is beautiful, beautiful port work. This thing should absolutely scream, and I'm pretty stoked to go on to the next part. So I'm probably gonna take a second, put this stuff to the side for the time being that the blower is now rebuilt. And I'm gonna start focusing on getting the engine all cleaned up and set back on the new mounts on the subframe, and getting all the engine, gearbox, subframe stuff mounted back together so we can get going, get the supercharger at that point properly back on top of the engine, get everything all reconnected, all the lines, all the vacuum lines, all the electrical connections, everything that we can with the engine on the ground in front of us. And then we can get putting this thing back in the chassis. The only thing we have yet to install on this is I need the pulley. And to be honest, I tried removing the pulley off of the other shaft from the supercharger that was originally in here, because this is still the original supercharger, but the ported casing I bought came with a whole bunch of other stuff. And when I rebuilt this snout, it wasn't possible to rebuild the snout and replace the bearings with the pulley on. And the shaft that came with the ported casing came with the pulley already removed. So rather than removing our pulley and trying to replace the bearing and then trying to reinstall it on the same shaft, I built the supercharger with the shaft that came with the ported casing, which is all good, but it does mean I still have to install a pulley on that shaft. But that's something I can do with it in the car. The installation is really easy. It's the removal of these supercharger pulleys, as you will have seen if you've seen the original video when I did the full build on this car. But that can all be done in the car. So that is ready to install. I need to install the intake manifold and charge coolers around it, but that's all relatively minor stuff, and that is all ready to bolt onto the engine. Take a look here. I have left these all filled in here just so nothing gets in. But one of the projects I have done over the last few months is I did take a day and I did leave a couple undone so I can show you cleaning them. But if you take a look, I have done a full carbon clean. That is what these cylinders were looking like beforehand. Nothing atypical, but definitely pretty gross. Whereas you look at the cylinders I've done, nice and clean. You can see the shine of the porous metal of the heads, and much, much, much better and easier to make power. So you can see there's a couple, like this cylinder here, that I left mostly done, but not quite 100%. Most of these are pretty well done. That is about the last guy I have to completely do, but I wanted to show you guys on camera, and to be quite honest, when I was doing this, was a day where I didn't feel like recording, I didn't feel like really doing anything. I just needed to come out and use my hands, and I really wanted to get the Jag back going because it probably doesn't show based on the amount of time that it has been since this car was on the road, but I would like this car back on the road more than almost anything, get the shop space back and get driving it. It's a ton of fun. I really miss that car. It is the ultimate daily driver in so many ways, and I want to get back to that. That being said, I am going to set you guys up here and kind of show exactly how I've done the intake valve cleaning, because that is the next step. And once the intake valve cleaning is all done, I can install stuff back on the blower and get the blower back installed on this engine. It shouldn't be too bad. I have done almost all the work already. It's just time to get it done. This is what I've been using for cleaning the intake valves. Just CRC intake valve and turbo cleaner. It's meant to clean out the carbon deposits. And all I've been doing, as ridiculous as it seems, is I have got a little detailing brush that I have 100% ruined, but that's okay. Been spraying this stuff into the intake valves, making sure to rotate the entire engine assembly so that the valves I'm working on are currently closed. And this is great practice for, if no other reason,
I'm seeing that all of my intake valves are sealing absolutely beautifully. Like anytime I've put liquid in, it has not leaked into the cylinder at all, which is awesome and means that this engine, even though I haven't done a leak down on it, should leak down absolutely fantastic, which is great. But I've been spraying this in, putting this in the chuck of my drill, and just going to town. The bristles are fairly soft. It hasn't seemed to hurt anything except the brush, but that is 100% fine. And then I've been using some compressed air and towels and other things, kind of just screwing around with it to get this all done. I tried a bit of brake clean as well, and that seemed to cut through it really well. I'm actually currently out of brake clean, but I still have lots of this guy left. So this is what we are going to use to finish up this process. We can see we've left the one intake valve that I just showed you guys that is completely gummed up. I'm gonna get that thing soaking right here so that all that carbon starts to dissolve, which funny enough, it is crazy how much carbon has been in here. All of these cylinders look like this. And I have paperwork and proof that the carbon cleaning was done on this engine like 10,000 kilometers ago. So this is absolutely a crazy, crazy amount of carbon buildup for that short amount of time. And it is proof that we will definitely get a catch can set up on this car as we get it put back together, because that is what causes this. When you don't have your injectors cleaning your intake tract, when they are directly injected into the head like they are on the vehicle, there's some more efficient things about that, but there is also some downfalls in that the intake runners stay really, really dirty. Success. All right, so finally done. I don't even know how many hours I spent cleaning these valves. Like, I think it ended up being 5-10 minutes worth of sped up time-lapsed footage that I spent on these valves. And that's at taking one photo every half a second in the recording of that. So this took a long time. Like, this is a few hours today to finish this up. And I mean, I had two that were almost done and one that I hadn't started yet. The others were all already done, but it's a huge win. Got one side of the intake manifold clean here. I am just about to clean the other side. It's nothing too crazy, but of course you got some oil debris inside here, some of the old red sealant that was used on the old supercharger gasket and whatever else. And of course, got this one all nice and shiny. Gasket surfaces are cleaned both top and bottom. Let's get done number 2. Things are about to get exciting. So I've got the second intake manifold all cleaned up here. I had just set them on and mocked them up. I've got actually green tape covering the intake runners just to make sure nothing fell in. But this is awesome. We've got stuff starting to go back together. I'm going to get the blower on the bench over here. We're going to reassemble the manifold side pieces here onto the blower itself, and we can get the blower actually all back mounted up. As I mentioned earlier, the pulley is not on there. That's going to be done later, and that's okay. And then we will still have to clean the upper portion with the charge coolers that sit in here, but we're making good progress. And even to get the supercharger itself bolted back onto the engine with this is going to be a huge win. And just like that, the supercharger is all bolted up on the engine. This is super exciting. We've got a touch of blue Loctite on all these bolts just to ensure that stuff stays happy and where it is, but everything is all bolted down. We've got the gaskets replaced for the intake runners underneath on either side. These are all cleaned up, and the gasket surfaces are all cleaned up. It looks so fresh and shiny, which feels fantastic. It is currently approximately 10 o'clock, and I need to pick up some more supplies for cleaning the rest of the intake manifold here. I've done a lot of cleaning, and it is looking way better, but I don't really feel like removing the charge coolers because I kind of tried. I pulled the 4 bolts off of this side charge cooler to try and pull it off the intake manifold, and it was a little sketchy. It was stuck on there really well, and I don't want to hurt anything. I know it's possible. I know if I need to, I could remove the charge coolers,
and I've actually got a spare one over there as well. But I really don't feel like going that way. I'm gonna pick up some more brake clean and a couple things so that I can reach under and clean in here. As you can see by the fact that I'm currently wearing different clothes, this ended up being an entire second evening's project in and of itself, but the intake manifold is finally all clean. There ended up being way more oil residue and crap trapped on the top side of the charge coolers than I'd have thought. If you take a look right here, it's really hard to tell, and I'm sure it looks really clean there, which is quite nice. But the unfortunate part is there was so much stuff trapped up and under on both sides, on the opposite sides of the charge coolers, just oil residue and gunk, no different than was on the valves. Because of course, all the gunk that made it to the valves is stuff that went through the charge coolers on its way to the valves. So there was so much left buildup of gunk and crap in there that these things were disgusting. It got to the point I went and picked up 6 Pro cans of brake clean, so the really big ones that have massive capacity, and ended up using 3 of them in entirety and a little bit of the 4th can, flushing this all out so it's beautiful, perfect, and clean. And you can still see a touch of staining through the top side, but things are clean, and this is finally ready to go back on so we can seal back up the intake manifold slash the supercharger. Just gonna try and squirt on me a little bit because there is still intercooling fluid left over inside of this thing, but away we go, and down it goes. I swear, at this point, probably doesn't seem like much, but this project and this car has been so freaking long in the works that setting this stupid thing back down on top of the ported blower, all installed on the engine, feels like a huge win. Finally, the entire supercharger slash charge cooling slash intake manifold assembly is done, bolted down, tightened up, and ready to go. The level of stoke right now is insane. I feel like today is gonna be the day. And I know that every time I say something like this in this video, for you guys, it's like, whatever, it's been 2 seconds. For me, well, being realistic, the last time I recorded was extremely brief as I put the supercharger lid back on and finished cleaning all the charge cooling. But the reality is, that's 3 days ago. And before that, it was a few days. And before that, it was like a month. And before that, it was like another month and a half. But today is the day that this goes back in there. We really don't have much to do to make that happen. As I just mentioned, I'm gonna change the transmission fluid here. And the main thing elsewise that I wanna do is just walk around and look at everything. Obviously, I have to finish bolting the bracketry back onto the back of the supercharger here. I want to give this thing a full look over. The biggest challenge at this point is just going to be remembering all the things and the stuff and referencing exactly what all I need to know to bolt that back in and make sure everything is good and happy. Making along quite well here. Finally got the supercharger all back done. And funny enough, this stupid little thing right here was one of the biggest wins now that this is done. Obviously, I've still got to put the belt on, and there is still a couple other oddball things that need done here. But this is what it took. I ended up drilling a hole in the end of the old shaft because funny enough, that supercharged pulley hub was nearly impossible to remove. I tried a lot of different stuff, both heat, force, yada yada yada, before hitting the realization that maybe I should just destroy the shaft because that would be quite easy and I have no idea when or why I would need to use it again, especially because that shaft specifically had some wear on the other end. We take a look right here from the old sprung coupler.
wearing into it. The reality is I should have just thought of this sooner, and I have spent way too much time, but now it's done. I've got this swapped on and ready to go, and it's crazy because you can see there's zero play of any kind going on in there. Whereas if we go to the stock one on the shelf, you can see a crazy amount of play, mostly from the stock coupler. Previously, I had thought this one had a sprung coupler, but it wasn't. There was just enough play in the bearings that I could feel a touch of play. In the first video I made, when I originally installed the pulley on the non-ported blower, I thought it was still a sprung coupler, because when I did this, I could feel a little bit, and now I can feel absolutely nothing. So that is really good. The blower is all assembled, happy, spinning quite well, moving air well through some of the ducting and some of the areas where it is able to escape. Yeah, quite stoked. We still need to get the belt back on the supercharger drive assembly, and that kind of completes this area of things. I've got the bypass valve installed back on the ported blower, and that's all put in the correct position. A guy just has to gap all of this and put all the set points correctly, because obviously this can slide, along with there is a set screw for the bypass valve, and that has all been set partially before I put it on and before I put it together, and partially just now. We're making along great. I still have to put the fuel line back on that crosses over the engine. I still have to finish doing the transmission fluid change. I have already put in new oil and a new filter in the engine in general. Supercharger's all rebuilt, got fresh fluid, installed all of this back on the back side of the blower, all the vacuum lines and hose stuff going on. Everything's all connected and should be all bolted up and ready to go. We're insanely close to just wheeling it back underneath the car and starting to bolt it in. I know that this has been super interrupted here, there, and everywhere, but we're making really good progress. The other things that I did off camera as well that you guys have not seen is I repacked all the bearings on all the pulleys, because if we take a look, there is a ton of them. Of course, we've got two different drive belt things going on here. There is the back for the accessories, and that is, you know, like your air conditioning, alternator, power steering, all that. And there is lots of different pulleys back there that have bearings in them to repack, which we already did. Same thing here. On the front side, there is this guy, and this guy here that were all repacked. The idea behind that being they have bearings inside them, and all the bearings looked in really good shape, but the grease inside does eventually like wear out / go out of its useful life. So I cleaned them all out, repack them with grease. It's nothing crazy, but it does make the engine sound quite a bit quieter. We've got a few of the PCV lines, such as breather right here that'll go back on the intake, but that's all back on. We've got our breather here that goes from this head to the throttle body. And funny enough, eventually what we will do is I will ditch this guy, and they will be replaced with rubber line that will go out to a catch can and then back into their original spots, which will help so we don't have to do a carbon clean anywhere near as soon again. We've got the fuel line all connected up here and bolted back down. Got our bypass valve on, as we mentioned earlier. We got the supercharger pulley on and all the belts on. The only real stuff that's left, best of my knowledge, is we are going to have to swap this guy out yet and get new fluid in the gearbox while it's out. I am going to put the starter back on because that is not currently on. And I am going to check all the bell housing bolts and the torque converter bolts just to be safe. And after that, we can take this whole assembly, instead of having it on the jack stands, we can get it on our rolling dollies, make sure the engine bay is clean and clear, and we can walk it right back underneath and start bolting it in the car. And everything pretty much is all ready. We've got all of the hoses are all assembled on the front here, both the coolant side of things and some of the vacuum hose side of things. I realized that I was an idiot, and there's a hose right there and a hose right here that I had not connected on the bottom of the throttle body, so I had to do some fishing. I actually used a coat hanger to fish this one because it comes from the backside and goes
underneath the supercharger. Off camera, we did do the spark plugs as well. These ones were only about 4,000 kilometers old, but they're nearly impossible to get to with the engine in the car. So just decided for the small additional price, we're just gonna do them again. That's all good and done. All of the PCV valve is back on, and all the lines around this side of things are all good. All the plumbing back here is all done and good. The bell housing bolts have been checked. The torque converter bolts have been checked. On the underside here, we have reinstalled the starter, and that's all good. We're finally pretty much the end of it. I'm gonna go in for the night. This has been a multi-day process, but finally, most of the difficult stuff involved in getting the engine back in the car is all done. Because getting the engine back in the car, funny enough, is all the easy part. That's just bolt together assembly. And there's still gonna be some puzzling to do, just because that's how these things go. But it really shouldn't be too bad. At least I'm hoping so. It should only be an evening/a day process to get the engine back in and get the dash back lit up and hopefully give this thing a first backfire. I think I should have everything all needed. The only remaining thing I'm gonna have to do tomorrow before I can put it in is pull the pan off, put transmission fluid in, and swap the new pan on. I just kind of ran out of time tonight. It's not the end of the world. It's just part of doing this, and that is all fine and dandy. There's been so much stuff to do while the engine's out, and none of it necessary, but all of it fantastic. We're finally to the end of it. I'm stoked to see how the new ported blower does. Stoked to get this engine back in the chassis. I'll catch you guys 2 seconds for you, tomorrow for me. I swear at this point, recording these daily/nightly vlog portions of working with the Jaguar, starting to feel like an apocalypse movie, where I'm like the last remaining man daily vlogging so I don't go insane. But we're making good progress. I'm back in. The last thing we have to do tonight before I can start shoehorning this thing back in the Jaguar is to finish the transmission fluid change. I'm gonna do another quick once over after that just to make sure that I didn't miss anything, but I think that should be all before the engine just goes back in. So I am going to get this fluid finish changed. I've already started and drained it out, but we're gonna get that done and get the engine going back towards the car. Well, this is quite fantastic. This is good reinforcement. If we take a peek, this of course is our transmission sump, if you will, slash filter slash pan assembly. Taking a look, those are both magnets right there, and there is not an ounce of metal or sludge on either of them, which is awesome. If we take a peek, similarly under here, inside the gearbox, everything's clean, happy, nothing looks burnt, smells burnt. Got nothing to complain about. So we're gonna slap the new pan finally on, fill it up with fluid, because that is your fill hole right there. And to fill it up with the transmission in the car is nearly impossible. So technically there is a whole procedure to how to fill one of these correctly and make sure you get the right amount of fluid. At least for now, all I'm doing is I measured the fluid I took out, which is approximately 7 liters. So we're gonna put approximately the same 7 liters back in. And we'll have to check the fluid level once we have the car running and whatever else and adjust as needed. But for now, at least, we're doing good. We're doing very good. So I'm gonna slap on the new pan, fill it up, let's start putting it in. Well, this is pretty sick. This is the most progress that has been made on this car in so freaking long, it's not even funny. The shop is an absolute mess, like it is a pigsty in here. But, we have made some seriously tangible progress, especially considering I only had a few hours to do it after work. You know, this whole thing where I gotta commute 2 hours every day kind of sucks. But we've got the engine in, we've got all 4 subframe mounts bolted on to the chassis of the car. We've got the transmission mount on to hold the transmission up. We don't have the struts connected, but they are kind of in their pocket. There's a whole bunch of stuff yet to connect, of course, and a couple oddball things I have connected.
Now is the fun part where this just kind of becomes a puzzle, and I just got to try and remember to connect everything. Of course, it's been a long time since I pulled this car apart. I'm sure I'll get it figured. I'm also sure I'll probably forget one or two things and have to go back and fix them. But this is massive progress, and see if we can't get this thing running in the next couple days. Okay, so it is a new day and I have set the rad pack in. It's nothing too crazy. All it is it sets in these little swoops kind of on the side with some rubber mounts. And I've just been trying to figure all of the routing for everything because there is so much of it. I left this full rad pack together, and this is the original one that came out of this car versus the other one that I did pull apart in an effort to try and keep the cooling system charged on the other car when I thought we were going to be using the other chassis, but we are not. Here we are, and here it all is. Looking, it's a little bit more difficult too because I have my custom piping I made for the intercooler. Obviously, there should be these stupid plastic lines that originally went to and from the charge cooler feed and discharge on both sides, but we have since gotten rid of them on this car. That was my solution I'd done last year that worked awesome. Versus, if we take a peek, this is what that whole shtick originally looked like. And these, although they're good for what they are, the reality is they're kind of prone to leakage and they're kind of terrible, to be 100% honest with you. So that's the stuff off the black car. That's what we're gonna put back in, but trying to get all the routing right is very difficult. I had labeled everything almost perfectly. There's a couple things that I didn't quite label perfectly, but there's also a little bit of added confusion because of course I had also bypassed the auxiliary cooler after I hit the coyote because the auxiliary cooler was leaking. This was the solution I came up with to just plain get the car home, and it worked great, but it is another added layer of complication because I need to remember how to rebuild this whole corner of the assembly so I can get this thing all back together happy, healthy, and correct. Theoretically, I don't think there's any reason really that we can't feed the car power right now and try and wake it up. It's just a matter of seeing how far we go and wanting to make sure that I check off as many boxes as I can to have as much stuff plugged in as I can, because although it's probably fine, basically just to plug it in now that we've got the engine harness hooked up, I'd rather try and hook up as much as I can within reason. And while we're at it, because why not, sort of for me talking aloud, sort of for me filling you guys in, looking at the cooling system on this car, it is super complicated. There's piping everywhere, but it also isn't too bad. Of course, for coolers, we've got radiator, the intercooler or your air to water intercooler, and then there's supposed to be an auxiliary radiator right there that we're gonna have to steal off of the parts chassis that's outside. As far as the intercooling system goes, of course, we did a bunch of upgrades. I've got this line that runs down to the ice tank in the back, as well as this line right here that runs to the ice tank in the back. This is our return. So that dumps fluid in so it can flow down through the intercooler, go out here into the intercooler pump, which then sends it around back. Follow this line here. This is gonna get plugged into one of those Y pieces on the ground, and it feeds the charge coolers. Then there's a separate line that returns the feed from the charge coolers, and that goes right here, which of course flows to the trunk where I've got another pump mounted along with the icebox. Originally, the reason that they're tied in together, that the engine cooling and the intercooling are tied in together, is because there needs to be an overflow tank, and there isn't an overflow tank from stock for the intercooling system, but as the fluid expands and contracts, it has to have somewhere to expand and contract into, so it uses the factory one that sits here for the engine coolant. But again, temperature-wise, that's not super smart, so what we did is theoretically this and this would have tied in together, and we've essentially bypassed that, and that's where our ice tank comes in. So the ice tank is also our overflow tank for the intercooling system, and that helped an absolute ton, especially now that we spent a ton of time cleaning the charge coolers / cleaning the intake valves / doing all the stuff we did with the supercharger. This thing should be cooling like crazy. Transitioning over to the engine cooling side of things, of course, it is ridiculously complicated for what it is, but all German cars are, and it's not too bad as we break it down. Our thermostat housing is right here that goes. We've got the feed from the bottom of the radiator for all the coolant to go into, and then we've got our water pump right here feeding our motion. Got stuff going in and out of the engine via these channels, and then of course we've got an outlet here that's going to go to the top of the radiator to return fluid in. Aside from that, that's not really the complicated part. That's all pretty standard issue. Where it gets a little bit more complicated with these, we do have a heat exchanger right down there for the transmission fluid. So that ties in to a connection right there. And then as well to a connection down here that kind of feeds coolant in and out through there. And then we've got our auxiliary lines, one of them being right here and one of them being right here, that go in and out of the radiator. One, this guy right there, and then this guy will go underneath, and it connects on this bottom corner. And those two feed the auxiliary radiator that will live right here once we get pulled off the other car. We also have this line on the ground right there that I'm stepping on, and that is kind of a secondary feed. It'll end up going from here, which goes back to the heater core to heat the cabin, and then it goes across, has one connection down here, and then it actually goes over to the rad reservoir as well, along with this bleed off line right here. Hopefully this isn't too much of a pain in the butt. This is actually a different setup than stock, the way the bleed off lines work. These are kind of meant as a bypass for the thermostat so that there's always a way for coolant to flow through / have an overflow path, so that if the thermostat is shut, it's not actually hurting things. There's still a way for coolant to flow a little bit. These are ridiculous and known to be very, very terrible. Same thing with this. This one's actually been replaced. The original part on these cars was actually plastic. This one is not. But these stupid little click-in fittings, I purposefully made sure not to remove this one. I had to remove this one, but it kind of fell out easily because the kind of locking tab inside is broken. But it should all seal up. This is actually all parts as well that I stole off of the parts car because it had been updated, whereas this car had not been updated. This is actually a different design. The original one was just a hose here that didn't have this tee-in, and it kind of teed off in a different way. But hopefully that should all be sealed up and happy, good. I think it was a little bit overkill. I did use some sealant here along with a zip tie to help keep this guy secured, just because it is kind of in a vulnerable place and I really don't want it to leak on us. So we did put that all back together. That being said, I am gonna go to town a little bit here and try and get all the cooling connected. There's so many connections, so many different routings. The big pain in the butt isn't gonna be trying to figure where the hoses connect. I've kind of got that all figured. The big pain is going to be making sure they're routed correctly so that they're not getting rubbed through and they're not getting hurt. But I'm gonna get to work on that. I'll join you guys in 2 seconds here once I think I've got everything all plumbed up. It's one of the nice things about doing YouTube stuff that I can go back to some of my old videos and see/reference where things came apart. It's not exactly a 100% solution, but it's definitely helpful. We're making along quite fantastically in the engine bay here. Got all the hoses for the most part plumbed in. There's still a couple here that I have not from the auxiliary cooler, but I'll probably do that as I get the auxiliary cooler all built up and mounted. We've got everything else all connected though. Got the reservoir back bolted in, connected. I'm about to put a couple of the other things together in the back, I think, and just kind of keep assembling the engine bay a bit. And then in a minute or two here, as we get as much connected as I can, I'm probably going to take our wires that live right down here. Because right there is the chassis ground, the alternator wire, and the starter wire. And once I get all of those back hooked up, we can feed power back to the car and get it woken up. Well, I had not realized, but my camera battery died while I was doing some time lapse. The car is still far from together just yet, but I did put a bunch more of it together. I tried to get as much of the electrical hooked up as I can here. The headlights are still disconnected. Obviously the front bumper connection is still disconnected, along with a couple other oddball things. But for the most part, all the electrical is hooked up, barring a couple things on the front end here, and I left the starter unconnected for now because I really don't want this thing turning over. But I do have the battery all charged up and put back in the trunk. I'm about to connect that and feed it power again for the first time in a very, very long time. This is probably going to feel incredibly anticlimactic to everyone who is not me, but this feels like a very huge deal. Got power to the Jag for the first time in quite some time here. Oh. It's awake. It's been a very, very, very long time, but the Jaguar is awake. I can shut this thing off and disconnect the battery now, but that feels like such a big win. It's not even funny. I'll join you guys in 2 seconds to finish the rest of the assembly and get this thing fired up. Slowly getting the engine bay together here. Another thing that I wanted to make noteworthy, the original time when I put together the intercooling system, what I did is just connected all my rubber hoses like this. So I didn't actually put in proper 90s on this one, this one, this one, this one, and then as well as the one right there that connects to the intercooler itself. But I added in a 90 that I stole from right here on the parts car. So that's this exact part just spliced in right there. So there's not any kink right here. It wasn't bad before, but there was definitely a little bit of a kink when it was just straight line 90'd on. So I just swapped that out. I'm cutting apart the original hoses because I have a spare full set from the parts car. That's the only reason I hadn't pulled them apart before. And I mean, I ended up cutting some stuff off of the original intercooler hose set from this car just because I needed to in order to upgrade the cooling system. But while I've got it all apart, I'm cutting off the elbows from the originals. I'll cut off this hose piece right here and I will splice on the new hoses so that things click in, things are as they're supposed to be. Hopefully they don't leak. I don't really like this style of fitting anywhere near as much, but it will be cleaner. It will make sure there's no kink in the line at all, and it should work quite well. Only a couple hours worked on it here, but good progress made. I think I've got all of the intercooler hoses all properly hooked up. We installed our elbows on all 4 sides along with our hose elbow right there. I got the crash bar back properly mounted. So I'm gonna have to tighten up a couple of bolts, but that specific bolt right there is such a royal pain in the butt. It's not even funny, because at least when I pulled it apart, I had the exact same problem, and putting it back together, I didn't find a good way to get that bolt in. Besides, this needs installed at the same time as this, which is really, really a pain in the butt. And I just had to use a pry bar. So you can see here where that bolt hides down there. It's a lot more of a pain in the butt to put in than you'd think. Next step here is I'm going to get the auxiliary cooler back installed. Of course, after I hit the coyote, I installed myself this little plain loop so that there was a way I could get the car home, move the car, because of course the cooler was destroyed. So I'm gonna go outside and have to pop these bolts off on the car outside, get that swapped in, and that should be the last element before we can start filling up the engine cooling system. After that, I am gonna do some more rerouting with the intercooling system. I haven't yet decided if we're gonna do that before or after a first fire up of the engine as it sits. Probably smart to do it after and just get this thing running as soon as we can so we can hear it, see that it's healthy and happy and kind of ready to go before doing final touches like the intercooling system. We're not gonna need intercooling with what we're doing. And of course it doesn't hurt anything, right? I've got the 2 pumps unplugged because I've got an intercooling pump right there that is the factory one. And then there's also one in the trunk that I installed. But those pumps won't be running dry if they're not running.
And we should still be able to fire up the car, see what happens, see how it sounds, and make sure that nothing's spewing fluids and everything's all sealed. Once we've got the engine cooling system all filled and ready to go, there really isn't much left before we'll give this thing a fire. Gonna have to connect the downpipes. There's a few other things underneath that I connect / look at / inspect. Gonna re-hook up all the intakes setup just because the MAFs are on that. Makes sense. Make sure it's all happy and safe. And I am gonna make sure the engine spins over a bunch too before we actually fire it, just because the transmission didn't take as much fluid as it needs to. And I don't really trust that. So I'm gonna see if I get it spinning and get things moving, if it'll move some of the fluid around and allow me to put more fluid in, because we only got to put in about half the fluid we need. I'm gonna measure the fluid correctly. The only way to do that though is with the car warm after everything's all installed and done, which is really, really stupid, but kind of the way it works, unfortunately. And in accordance with that, I am going to spin it over and just try and put in as much fluid as I pulled out. I have still got a measurement of how much fluid I pulled out of the transmission, and I of course know how much fluid I have put in thus far. And unfortunately, there's a lot more that came out than I have put back in. So I'm gonna try and spin it a bit and see if in spinning it, I can't get it to take some more fluid just for the sheer sake of safety. But yeah, we are very, very close to giving this thing a fire. Auxiliary cooler is back installed. This is pretty easy and kind of nice because this whole assembly was all bolted together on the car outside. All I had to do was unbolt 1, 2, 3, line 1, line 2 connections. This guy right here broke off on the original setup, and what that is a TPMS sensor. So this is a sensor that's supposed to be by this wheel to measure the tire pressure, correlated from the sensor inside the tire. But the original one broke off when I hit the coyote. So we've got this one installed. The wiring is still actually traced in its little mounts underneath here. And we will splice that in as well to fix that guy. But now the cooling system is complete. The intercooling system is not yet. Technically, the intercooling system is actually sealed, but I'm gonna reroute some of the lines under the car. We're gonna put distilled water in the radiator system or the engine cooling system right now for 2 reasons, really. A little bit of Murphy's Law, because usually when you have everything apart, something's probably gonna leak, and I don't want coolant leaking on the ground, along with the fact it's just good to do a flush. The downside is right now, because it's cold outside, and I have to be very careful to keep the car inside when it's not running as I get it running until I flush it and put proper coolant in, because we are getting cold, and that is a little bit of gambling because that could potentially go very wrong. But if we do it the correct step-by-step way in not coolant yet and then add coolant, hopefully Murphy's Law will be good to us and it will be nice and easy. We're gonna fill this thing up, see if it pours fluid on the ground anywhere, and we are 1 step closer to get this thing fired up. I popped out this plug as well that belongs in the riser over there. If you guys can see, that helps the system breathe. This still isn't gonna fill up the first time around. It never does. These cars are particularly bad for that, but it is popped out for now. We're gonna see how much fluid we can fit in. One. This is gonna take some time. Well, it's not pouring on the ground just yet. We found a leak. Just kidding. We do not have a leak. I thought we had a leak. I just forgot. I pulled that out. I just plunked that back in. But we were definitely leaking some fluid out of that guy. I think we're okay. We've put 2 full containers, so those are not quite 4 liters. This system is supposed to take between 12 and 13 liters. So theoretically, from bone dry, we're missing about 4 liters as it sits right now. And I guess that's actually more like 2 to 3, maybe even 1 to 2 with what just hasn't circulated yet. We'll see how that goes exactly, but for now, we've got it somewhat filled, somewhat circulated, and we will just have to finish filling it up as the car gets warm and circulates the fluid. Right now, I'm gonna crawl underneath. I'm probably gonna hook back up the drive shaft just so things aren't bouncing around, hook up the exhaust, make sure that all of the pieces underneath are secured, tightly bolted down, filled up and done as best I can. Along with, there's a couple electrical things I still have to hook up, mainly the starter and the alternator, which I had purposefully left off so that when I lit up the electronics, we didn't accidentally try and start something that shouldn't have been started. All right, well, blood, sweat, and a lot of grease later. This thing is ready for a first fire up. There's still, of course, lots of stuff that is not yet done, as you guys can see. Lots of this isn't actually hooked up correctly / the way it's gonna be for a final product, but I believe we should have everything hooked up enough that we can start it. Just gonna connect the battery and open up the door, and I give Hope, who's sitting behind the camera here, the first honors of giving a startup so I can sit in the engine bay, listen, and tell her to shut it off if something goes wrong or if something's trying to spew everywhere, but fingers crossed. It's definitely gonna turn over a bunch before it fires for sure, because of course, there's no fluids or anything. The pump's gonna have to prime. There's gonna be lots of that on the go. We'll turn it off. Turn it on again. Just cycling the fuel pump a couple of times. You nervous?
No, you're nervous.
I am nervous. Done a lot of mechanical stuff. This one's a pretty big project though, and it's been apart for approximately a year. So this one feels like a big deal. Crank it up. Oh, hold on, hold. So far, so good. Hasn't driven yet, hasn't moved under its own power yet. There is still a lot to go, but it's running. And it sounds fairly healthy, sounds fairly happy. I'm pretty damn happy. Give it a couple small blips of throttle. That is all old. We know that's there. That's just from me spilling water a little bit earlier from the high-rise drain or / breather, and that is from me spilling while filling up. See, these engines are just a touch noisy in general, but damn. Epic. Shut it off. This place is a huge mess, but that is a phenomenal win. I'm super stoked on that. I forgot as well that we originally pulled the tuning from the car because we thought we were going to use the parts car chassis, and if we were going to do that, I wanted to pull the tuning out so I had the VIN license to tune that car. But turns out it didn't matter because we're using this anyways. I did forget though, we just started up on the factory tune. It did quite well. Honestly, it did quite well. The engine maybe sounds a touch loud, but I don't think anything out of the ordinary. These are loud engines, and it has been forever since I heard one running. Seem pretty happy, seem pretty healthy. The blower seems to be doing what it's supposed to. Even watching the bypass valve, the vacuum actuated bypass valve on top of the blower, that's all working like it's supposed to. Doesn't appear to be leaking any fluids. Everything sounds pretty damn happy and healthy, if I must say myself. I'm gonna flash in the tune here. Now that it's all together, we'll probably fire it up one more time just to be certain, do a little bit deeper inspecting and look at a couple more things. But after that, we can just continue putting the car properly back together. See here, of course, the dash is all freaking out. That's pretty normal though. We've got the tuner all hooked up and re-flashing in the tune file that we had previously in the car. The nice thing is, even though we added in a ported blower and a couple other things, the tune file here should still be able to account for all that. I actually did talk to Velocity AP about that a little while ago, and funny enough, the tuning that's in this car isn't super aggressive for what it could be, but it is pretty safe in turn with that. So it should be good. It's not quite gonna be maximizing exactly the fullest of the car's potential, but that's okay, because this car is already an absolute burnout monster.
We might still decide at some point here to switch over to Alpha Jag or one of the other reputable tuning companies that does specialize a little bit more in this platform as compared to some of the others. But for now, getting the tune file back in, car seems pretty happy and healthy. Can't wait to get this thing back together. First fire up done. I just crawled back underneath the car and put some more transmission fluid in it. Obviously we did install the tune file again, and then I kind of rigged up this little bit of a contraption. This is something I got on Amazon for like $12. Last time I did this with the transmission in the car, I used like a 50 milliliter syringe, something like that, and it took forever. This is a 500 milliliter syringe, so much faster, much more efficient. It's approximately 7 liters that I pulled out of the gearbox total. I was very careful to try and catch as much of the dripping fluid as I could, and I didn't really lose any. So as a good starting point, I'm still gonna have to check the fluid level the correct way, which is kind of where we're at now, because it's taken around 5.5 liters, 5.5, 6 liters. And to get this transmission correctly to the full mark, you do have to have the car running on flat ground. And of course, we can do that here, but we've got enough fluid in it at least. Now I'm going to probably finish filling up the transmission kind of right now, along with just let the car run and get completely up to temperature, let it run for 15 minutes or something, and just kind of see what it does before I actually go into a full final assembly. Because as much as I want to get straight to that, it's always a good idea to let this thing run up to temp, do its thing before we really spend time doing the final fit and finishes stuff. Obviously, there's lots of little detail-oriented things that we don't really need to do until we know we can. Like getting some of the suspension all buckled up and done. That's stuff that needs done, and theoretically we're probably fine to do it. But we're waiting till after confirming the engine and stuff is all happy, just for the sake of Murphy's Law, because if by some chance I pull that engine back out, I'm gonna feel like a real idiot if I gotta undo a whole bunch of the stupid detail-oriented stuff that I just did. So, I'm gonna get this thing back fired up. We're gonna set the transmission fluid level while it's running, let it run for a good 20 minutes, and go from there. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the XFR lives. Well, the Jag is finally running and I am super stoked about that. This thing has been sitting for way too long and I am so glad that we finally got it back fired up under its own power. Funny enough, after I shut it off here, or after I shut off the camera, I started the car back up a couple times and there might or might not be another problem that's gonna need addressed, but I'll fill you guys in on that next time. Hopefully it's not the end of the world, but I guess we shall find out. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate every bit of it. The channel is growing at good pace, which makes me so happy and stoked to do some more content stuff for you guys. Thank you so much. We'll catch you next time.